daughter's scream echoed through the room, a raw, heart-wrenching cry that filled the air. Her baby's tiny, lifeless body lay motionless on the bed, surrounded by sobbing family members. The room was a chaotic mix of grief and panic, as everyone tried to hold back Oma, who was desperately trying to get closer to her baby. Then, without warning, something happened that shocked everyone in the room, sending them running for cover. What you're about to witness will stay with you, long after the story ends. The funeral room was heavy with wailing and sad cry of family and friends, who could no longer hold their tears. The feeling of disbelief and shock filled the air. "We just saw Dimpia playing and giggling a few hours ago. How could she possibly be dead?" the neighbors whispered. Tega and his wife Oma refused to accept that their beautiful baby, their firstborn child after 3 failed miscarriages, was laying lifeless. At the center, the dead baby laid peacefully in a small white coffin, while family and friends buried their faces in their hands, crying uncontrollably. They know how much Tega and Oma suffered before finally having their only child. Tega sat in the corner, his elbows resting on his knees, hands covering his face. He couldn't bear to look at his daughter's body. Oma, on the other hand, was trying to wake her baby up, wailing and shaking the coffin while her family members and friends held her back and tried to calm her down. She refused to be comforted. Her fingers gently brushed the tiny cold hand of Dimpai, desperately looking for any sign that can convince her that her daughter was only sleeping. Her face was swollen from hours of crying, lips trembling, her eyes lost in a deep sea of pain. "Please wake up, Dimpai," she whispered, her voice breaking and barely audible. Each word was a desperate prayer for something, anything to bring her back. But there was no answer. The silence that followed felt like a cruel punch to her chest. She kept repeating those words over and over, as if that would bring her daughter back to her. Beside the coffin, Agil, the family's German shepherd, laid motionless. He had been restless since the moment Dimpai's body was brought into the room. The dog couldn't understand why his little friend wasn't waking up to play with him. He would lift his head occasionally with a confused whimper, gazing up at Oma with eyes full of questions. What was happening? Why was Dimpai not moving? But Agil didn't need words to understand that something terrible had happened. He felt the weight of it in the air. "You should sit down, Oma." Her mother's voice trembled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I can't leave my daughter alone. She was just here a few hours ago," Oma screamed back, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. Tega lifted his gaze toward his wife. He wanted to say something, anything, that could ease even a small part of her pain, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he comfort her when he was broken too? He looked around, seeing the downcast faces of family and friends, all of them trapped in their grief. Suddenly, his eyes went back on the small casket. Dimpai's face, so peaceful, laid inside the coffin. Tega closed his eyes, trying to escape the pain. He remembered the first time he held his daughter in his arms, how Dimpai's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. He remembered the sleepless nights walking the room, singing songs to soothe Dimpai's cries. Their dog Agil always by her side, as if he too understood his duty to protect the baby. From the moment Tega and Oma brought Dimpai from the hospital after she was born, something changed in the dog. Agil sniffed Dimpai carefully, as if he was saying, "I'll take care of you." In the first few weeks, Agil never left the crib. If Dimpai cried, Agil ran to find Tega or Oma, barking urgently. "It looks like this dog is Dimpai's guardian angel," the neighbors would joke. "He really understands his job." As Dimpai grew, Agil's role as protector became clearer. When Dimpai started to crawl, Agil always positioned himself between her and any danger. Furniture, stairs, anything that could hurt her. Agil seemed to know when danger was near. Dimpai's first words weren't mama or dada, but a soft cha-cha, the name she had given to her beloved dog. It was always cha-cha cum, cha-cha here. They were very close. One afternoon while playing, Dimpai crawled and tipped over, hitting her head on the furniture. She began to cry, her sobs loud and uncontrollable. Before Oma could get to her, Agil was already there, gently licking Dimpai's cheek, offering comfort. Still crying, Dimpai wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, as if Agil was the one who could fix everything. That was the moment Oma realized. This bond was something special, something that would last forever. Meanwhile, in the funeral room, as Tega turned toward the dog, Agile was lying quietly, his eyes fixed on the body of their baby, his gaze filled with a sadness that seemed almost human. As morning came, some family members began to walk out of the room. Oma sat beside the casket, exhausted from her tears, while Tega stood a few feet away, watching Agile. The dog hadn't moved. His eyes never left Dimpai. Some family members tried to get Oma and Tega to go rest so that they would have strength to bury their baby in the morning. As Tega was about to walk out of the room, he saw it, the restlessness in Agile. His breathing was fast, his ears perked, his calm eyes now filled with something else, an intensity, a purpose. Then the moment arrived. A family member walked toward the casket to cover it completely. Tega placed a hand on Oma's shoulder, feeling her tremble with fear. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Before Oma could respond, Agile jumped onto the small table, placing his paw on the cover of the casket, stopping him from closing it. A stunned murmur spread across the room. No one knew what to say. No one dared to intervene. Agile's gaze was locked on Dimpai, filled with something indescribable, a silent plea. "Agile," Tega called softly, stepping toward the dog. "Come here, boy." But Agile didn't move. Instead, he gently placed his paw over Dimpai's small hand. It was such a delicate gesture that even the most skeptical person knew the dog was up to something. Oma gasped, seeing the love their dog had for their baby, covering her mouth in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this," some people whispered, stepping back. Tega, still in shock, reached out to touch his daughter's hand for the last time before the coffin was closed. The skin was cold. But then, something changed. A very quiet, gentle movement. Tega's heart stopped. "Oma," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, confusion and hope in her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Her hand." "It moved," Tega murmured, voice shaking. Oma's body froze. "What did you say?" "I felt it," Tega repeated, more certain this time. "The baby's hand squeezed mine." A stunned silence filled the room. The few people left looked at each other in disbelief. Was it possible? Had Tega really felt what he thought he did? Oma, shaking, rushed to the casket. She touched Dimpai's other hand, hoping, praying for any sign. And then, there it was, a slight movement in her fingers. She gasped and screamed so loudly. "I felt it! Oh my goodness!" she cried, her voice breaking. Tega leaned over his daughter, his eyes wide with hope. Dimpai's face was still pale, but her chest started moving very slowly, a slight rise. It was so small, it could have been missed by anyone not paying attention. "Oh my goodness! She is breathing!" Oma whispered, barely believing it. "Get help! Please get the doctor!" Tega shouted. The people hesitated, thinking that Tega and Oma were just imagining things. But as Tega screamed more for help, someone pulled out his phone to call a doctor friend from a different hospital. Meanwhile, Agile jumped down from the casket and sat by their side, watching Dimpai intently, as though he had known this moment would come all along. The ambulance arrived and the medical team rushed to the casket. The doctor checked Dimpai's vital signs. "There's a pulse," he said, his voice serious, "but it's weak. We need to move her immediately." Oma gripped Tega's arm, her body trembling. "Do you think she'll be okay?" she asked in a whisper. Tega didn't know what to say. All he knew was that there was now a chance. As the paramedics wheeled Dimpai into the ambulance, Agile stayed close, walking beside them, never leaving their side. For the first time in hours, days, Tega and Oma felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, their daughter wasn't gone forever. It was a road full of setbacks, each one more painful than the last. The days blurred together, good news one moment, followed by a frightening complication the next. But through it all, their dog, Agile, remained steadfast. One evening, as Oma sat alone in the waiting room of the hospital, the stress of the past week with Dimpai in the ICU had taken its toll. She rested her head against the cold window, her eyes fixed on the ICU doors. "How much longer?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A few minutes later, Tega came in, his face filled with exhaustion. He sat beside her quietly, trying to comfort her. As the days passed, Dimpai's condition remained fragile but slowly improving. One day, The first sign of consciousness came like a miracle. Dimpy's fingers twitched. Oma had been holding her baby's hand, and when she felt the slightest squeeze, she was in shock. Tears rushed down her cheeks. She moved again. She told Tega, "Please call the doctor." Tega rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you sure?" he asked, though he could already see it in her eyes. He knew. "She is waking up. Our baby is finally waking up, coming out of coma. Please get the doctor." The doctors came in to examine the baby. They were cautious, not wanting to give any certainty. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope was real. The tension in the hospital room began to ease, but another storm was heading their way. The thought of almost losing their only child was still too fresh. The feeling of helplessness, of being ignored by Dr. Uche in the previous hospital, lingered like a shadow over their thoughts. "What exactly happened? Why was your baby unconscious laying inside a coffin?" the doctor asked. Tega began to narrate the story to the doctor. Yesterday, Dimpy was playing with Oma in the loft. As she was playing with her mother, Oma stepped away briefly to use the restroom. Dimpy, curious just like any other baby, crawled toward the stairs. Unknowingly, as she stretched to go down the next step, she missed her step, tumbled and rolled all the way down to the bottom step, hitting her head and tiny body as she tumbled from one step to another. When she landed, she let out a horrific scream that Oma had never heard before. Agil rushed to help her. He licked her face, trying to calm her down from the excruciating pain as usual. But this time it was different. Oma, on hearing the scream, jumped off the toilet seat and ran towards the sound. "Oh my God, it can't be my baby," she screamed as she flew down the stairs to get to Dimpy. She grabbed her off the ground and comforted her. Oma cried as she watched her tiny baby scream in such excruciating pain. This is a sound she had never heard before. She held her close to her chest, grabbed her boob, and gently shoved it into her baby's mouth, trying her best to soothe Dimpy through breastfeeding, but Dimpy refused every effort to be quiet. She kept crying so loudly, which made Tega and Oma fear that something was terribly wrong. It took an hour to calm Dimpy down. Her parents gave her a warm bathe and breastfed her until she slept off. Few hours later, the incident took a dark turn. While breastfeeding Dimpy, Oma felt that her baby was warmer. "She is very warm. I think she is not feeling well," she told Tega, who walked towards the baby to touch her skin. "You wrapped her very tightly in a blanket." "That's why she is warm," Tega responded. They both brushed off the concern. "Let's put her down to sleep, Oma," Tega said. They walked to the nursery and gently laid Dimpy down to sleep. But every few minutes she had quick gasps for air, as her tiny body struggled to recover from overwhelming emotion and pain. After midnight, when Tega woke up to use the toilet, he had no idea that his wife was going to take a turn for the worst. He walked into Dimpy's room to check on her when he gently touched their baby to see how she was doing. He noticed that her skin was burning hot, and the baby was shaking and shivering violently due to high fever. Tega quickly ran back to their room to wake Oma up. "Wake up, Oma, something is wrong," he shook his wife, who jumped up from her sleep. "What is it?" Oma asked in panic. "It's Dimpy. She is not feeling well," he responded as they both rushed back to Dimpy's room. As soon as they entered, they noticed that their baby was struggling to breathe and seemed to be fading before their eyes. "We have to rush to the hospital now," Tega yelled. Desperate, they grabbed their baby's tiny body, wrapped her in a blanket, and headed to the hospital, hoping doctors could help Dimpy get through this. When they arrived at the emergency room of St. Thomas Hospital, it was busy. There were a lot of people waiting, and the nurses and doctors were stretched thin. Dimpy's condition seemed urgent. "What happened to her?" Dr. Jude, who was on call that night, asked. She fell from the stairs and has been crying ever since, and now she has fever and not breathing well," Tega responded. Dr. Jude barely looked at the baby, distracted by his phone and all the other patients that needed his attention. "Oh, is that all? It's normal for babies to fall when they are learning to crawl or walk." He quickly brushed off the severity of the situation, declaring that Dimpy was just scared from the fall. "She will be okay," he said to Tega and Oma. No tests or scan were done to check her diagnosis. The doctor's indifference and rushed judgment set the stage for the disaster that followed. Dr. Jude turned to the nurse. "Admit the baby and give her something to bring down the fever," and I will be back to check on her." He walked off to see another patient. Tega and Oma were confused and worried. They tried to voice their concerns, but Dr. Jude's dismissiveness made them feel like they were overreacting. "Ma'am, I am the doctor here. Just stay here while I do my job, okay? Or do you want to do my job for me?" He scolded them. They kept quiet and waited in the crowded waiting room, unsure of how serious the situation really was. The nurse took Dimpai from her parents, placed her in a little crib in one of the rooms, and gave the baby pain reliever to help with the fever as Dr. Jude had prescribed. What they didn't know was that in the hours that followed, Dimpy's condition deteriorated significantly. As time passed without any more checkup, Dimpy's tiny body began to shut down. She stopped breathing for a moment, and it seemed like she was no longer alive. A nurse who was concerned but wasn't fully aware of the baby's condition due to the lack of proper communication hurriedly informed Dr. Jude. "Doctor, Jude, something is wrong with the baby. I think you should check it out," the nurse said. Dr. Jude, who was so focused on his phone, "I will be there shortly," he responded. The nurse went off to see other patients. 15 minutes later, Oma, not seeing any movement from the doctor or nurses, went out to the lobby to call the nurse. "Please, can you come and help my baby? We have been here for a long time, and you people are not doing anything to help my baby," she yelled, frustrated. The nurse looked up in confusion. "What about Dr. Jude? Didn't he come to check on the baby?" the nurse asked with deep concern. "No, he did not. Nobody did," Oma yelled back. The nurse hurried back into Dr. Jude's office to remind him about the sick child. Dr. Jude got up angrily as if the nurse was bothering him and walked towards the room that Dimpia was admitted in. He opened the door and briskly walked towards the crib where Dimmy was laying. He grabbed his stethoscope from his neck, listened for signs for life, then pause. Without double-checking or even attempting to revive the child, he turned to the nurse who was standing beside him and said, "Patient has no vital signs." Without any empathy, he said, "Inform the family and prepare the paperwork for the death certificate." And within minutes, Dimpai was declared dead. The hospital staff didn't even run the necessary tests to confirm the baby's passing. They had simply accepted the doctor's word, and they moved forward with preparations for the family to say goodbye. No one questioned the decision, and everyone, including the grieving parents, was left in shock. When Oma and Tega were told their daughter had died, it was like the world had stopped. They couldn't understand it. The doctor spoke to them as if the decision was final. "She's gone, and I'm sorry about your loss. You brought him too late, and there is nothing we can do about it." Dr. Jude attempted to put the blame on Tega and Oma. "But we were trying to tell you to run some tests. X-ray, MRI, something, anything, check his brain, check for internal bleeding. And you were not listening. You did not listen. You said you were the doctor and you knew everything. Now our baby is dead. Is that what you are telling me?" Tega rushed towards Dr. Jude and grabbed him by his collar, yelling at his very aggressively. The security and nurses ran towards him to help get Dr. Jude off Tega's strong, angry grip. It felt unreal. Oma collapsed into Tega's arms. The doctors and nurses seemed too eager to move on, to push them through the process as if it was just another case, another statistic. The couple couldn't bring themselves to believe it. Dimpy was just fine a few hours ago. How could she be dead all of a sudden? Tega ran to the room where their baby was admitted in. As he entered, he saw his baby laying peacefully on the bed. He bent over, placing his ear closely to the baby's nose to check her breathing, but nothing. He froze, looking at his baby in confusion. She was just fine a few hours ago. How could she be dead? "I'm sorry about this," a voice said from behind said. Tega looked up and it was the nurse. "I don't know how this happened. I'm so sorry." Oma was over the bed crying, trying to wake her baby up. The nurse held her, pulling her away from the baby, attempting to comfort her. Tega, confused and out of it. "We need to go home," he said to Oma. "These people are very wicked. We have to take our daughter home. I need to leave this hospital before I key somebody." Tega carried his baby's lifeless body and walked out of the room in absolute shock and confusion, not knowing what to make of what just happened, with Oma wailing and crying behind him. Their baby was just fine a few hours ago. Oma and Tega drove home in a daze, the weight of their grief pressing down on them. Their baby Dimpe lay lifeless in Oma's arms, her tiny body cold and still. Her tears fell freely, her cries of pain filling the car, but nothing could drown the emptiness she felt inside. When they finally arrived at their home, everything felt different. The house that had once been filled with hope and dreams for their baby now seemed suffocating and hollow. With trembling hands, they carried Dimpai inside and gently placed her on the bed in the middle of the living room. Oma sank to her knees beside the bed, clutching Dimpai's small hand, her cries growing more desperate. Tega stood nearby, his own face streaked with tears, his body stiff with disbelief. They called their family and their wailing brought the neighbors out. The doctor, Dr. Umar, listened in shocked. This was very careless of Dr. Jude. How could this have happened in a hospital? Well, Dimpai is conscious now and responding very well to treatment. We did MRI, X-ray, and ran a lot of tests to make sure we treated the right problems. She had a few broken bones and concussion from the fall. That's why she passed out for a while. With the treatment that we are giving, her brain is healing, and the bones are also healing. She is out of danger now, and her condition has improved significantly, the doctor assured Oma and Tega. Tega's mind raced, the pain too much to bear. How could this have happened? How could a hospital that is supposed to help the sick do nothing while my baby dies? Tega and Oma knew they couldn't let it go. If we don't take Dr. Jude and that stupid St. Thomas Hospital to court, what happened to us could happen again to another family. They began to gather evidence, speak to the nurses and people that watched the negligence of Dr. Jude. The patients that were present agreed to testify in court as well. The thought of pursuing justice wasn't just for their daughter, it was for every child who might be at risk because of mistakes made by doctors who failed to listen. One evening as they stood outside the ICU, watching Dimpai breathe steadily on the machines, Oma looked at Tega. "We have to do this," she said softly, determination in her eyes. For her, Tega nodded, his jaw clenched. For Dimpai, and for every family who could suffer the same fate, this can never happen again. After Dimpai was strong enough to be discharged, her parent Tega and Oma got a lawyer and charged Dr. Uche and the hospital to court for negligence. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and applause as the judge's verdict was read aloud. Oma squeezed Tega's hand, her eyes brimming with tears, but this time they were tears of victory, not sorrow. The fight had been long and painful, but in that moment it was all worth it. They had not only secured justice for Dimpai, but had also made sure that the hospital would be held accountable and that future families would not face the same heart-wrenching experience. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters cheered and clapped, with their voices united in triumph. Tega, Oma, and Dimpai stood before the crowd, with their dog Agile at their feet. A reporter approached them. "How does it feel to finally get justice for your daughter?" she asked. Tega, his voice steady but filled with emotion, replied, "It's a relief, but it's not just for us. It's for every child who has been mistreated or ignored in a hospital. It's for every parent who has had to watch their child suffer without help. Today, we have taken a stand, and we will make sure this never happens again." Oma nodded, her eyes locked on Dimpai, who was now standing beside her, smiling weakly but proudly. "This isn't the end. This is just the beginning," she said. "For Dimpai, for the families that will come after us, and for Agile, who never gave up on her. We've all fought for this, and we will keep fighting to make sure that things change." The news of the verdict spread quickly, and soon the hospital's response was swift. Dr. Jude was permanently stripped of his medical license, and his actions were publicly condemned. The hospital was forced to make comprehensive changes, overhauling its pediatric emergency protocols and increasing training for all staff members. The public outcry had been impossible to ignore, and the changes were seen as necessary to restore trust. As the family drove home, Dimpai sat in the back seat with Agile by her side, and for the first time in a long while, there was laughter in the air. Dimpai had regained much of her strength back, and Agile continued to play his role as the loyal companion, always ready to cheer her on. The family, though still recovering from the emotional scars, now looked towards the future with hope. If you enjoyed the story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.